Thank you very much. Thank you, Petra Guaste and Sarah Goodman. Now we will come back to the United States. We will be discussing a paper called Explaining Ethnoreligious Minority Targeting, Variation in US Anti-Semitic Event. This was published in Perspectives on Politics. The paper was written by Ayal Feinberg, and the discussant Kyriaki Topidi will serve as a discussant. Let me introduce them both now. Ayal Feinberg is an assistant professor of political science at Texas A&M University, senior fellow at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right in the United Kingdom, and the chair of the junior faculty section at the Academic Engagement Network. His research has been featured or is forthcoming in journals and media outlets, such as Perspectives on Politics, that's where the paper is coming from, International Interactions, Religion and Politics, Political Science and Politics, Contemporary Jewry, International Negotiation, Harvard National Security Journal, and the Washington Post's Monkey Cage. His scholarship is frequently utilized by practitioners and policymakers concerned with hate crimes targeting marginalized groups. His research was used as evidence and inducted into the congressional record during the 2019 House Judiciary Committee's hearing on hate crime and the rise of white nationalism. And thank you for being with us today. Kyriaki Topidi will serve as a discussant. She is a senior researcher and head of the research cluster on culture and diversity at the European Center for Minority Rights. She's in Flensburg, Germany. Her research interests focus on diversity management and minority protection rights and mechanisms, with a special interest in religion. She's the author and editor of several volumes and articles. At the European Center for Minority Issues, she's currently researching minority identity and digital governance, as well as research focuses also on the intersection of minorities with social movements. Thank you for being here. So I'll a few minutes and then I will turn to Kyriaki. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, guys. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay, well, I really, really appreciate the opportunity. David and Lenka gave me a couple impossible tasks today, which is describing and introducing my research in 5 minutes, and then following all of the amazing presentations we had today.
Ayal, this is Lisa. Can you speak up?
Sure, hold on, guys. Is this better for everyone?
Yes.
All right, no headphones then. Okay. So I was saying that David and Lenka gave me 2 impossible tasks. The first, introducing my research in 5 minutes, and the second, following all of the amazing presentations we had today. I want to speak first to the Lowe family. Thank you so much for putting this workshop together, for providing the resources for it. As somebody who studies anti-Semitism, especially in the American context, something like this is incredibly rare. And I hope you guys know that I think this is going to have a measurable impact on empirical research coming out on this topic in the future. Just from some of the ideas that we've shared today, I think this is going to be really valuable. So thanks. Thanks also to all the participants that are here. This paper actually was something that I presented first at the Association for Israel Studies Conference in 2018 alongside Jeffrey Kopstein. He doesn't know it, but his encouragement on that panel is probably why I was comfortable enough submitting this research. So if you don't like it, blame Jeff, don't blame me. In terms of other thank yous, of course, thank you to Lenka, David, and Lisa for everything. And also, I don't think it goes said enough, thank you to the audience. When we present as political scientists at our big conferences, we're lucky to have 5 or 10 people in the room. So to see this many attendees is really putting the pressure on. And of course, thank you to my discussant, who has the impossible task of critiquing a paper that's already been published. So anything that you say that's super critical, I'm going to blame on reviewer 2, and then everyone is out of luck. So no, on a serious note, thank you. I know there's a tremendous overlap in the amount of work that we do, so I'm really looking forward to that. So I am the guy who normally does like 30 slides or 40 slides, and the 15-minute presentations were allotted at conferences. So I'm going to try to do that same thing, but in 5 minutes. So see if we can break a record here. I'm going to start my video. Can everybody see the presentation? Okay, so I'm presenting to you guys today mostly the paper explaining ethno-religious minority targeting and variation in the United States, anti-Semitic events, but this is part of a broader book project that I'm working on called Insecurity in Paradise, Anti-Semitism in Modern America. Lenka and David were nice enough to tell me to definitely tease some of my upcoming findings that will be presented in that book manuscript. So I will be doing that today also. So without further ado, let's get started. So of course, any good conversation about the study of anti-Semitism in America should start with Europe. I was at Herzliya IDC getting my master's degree during Operation Pillar of Defense. So I knew that I wanted to study Israel, and I was beginning in the fall of 2014 to study my PhD. Israel was in the news because of Operation Protective Edge. But all of a sudden, I didn't want to study Israel in the same context. What I noticed is what was happening in the diaspora, really serious concerns regarding European Jewry, that some of the violence they were facing believed to be in part because of the behavior of Israel. And we can see that, right, when we look at some of the basic empirics. This is a collection of anti-Semitic events presented by month from the CST in the United Kingdom and the SPCJ in France. You can see the large increases here in the center where Operation Protective Edge took place. So just looking at descriptive statistics, we can see that there is something happening when Israel is engaged in a violent conflict. And of course, when we start thinking about anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic hate, Europe is a focus. So here we see what was happening in Toulouse had a huge impact on how we think of anti-Semitism. Of course, the kosher supermarket siege following the Charlie Hebdo attacks, even the Hale Synagogue shooting recently. But when we start digging a little bit deeper, there's a long history of lethal and violent anti-Semitic attacks that have occurred here in the United States. The Seattle Jewish Federation shooting in 2006, the DC Holocaust Museum shooting in 2009, the Overland Park incident in 2014, the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally. I consider this in part anti-Semitic violence or violence motivated by anti-Semitism. And this rally, even though we don't necessarily attach the same lethality as the other incidents that I'm talking about, this really changed the perspective of American Jewry, and we can see that in survey results. The most violent attack to ever target American Jewry, the Pittsburgh Synagogue Tree of Life massacre in 2018, the Poway Synagogue shooting only 6 months after, the Jersey City kosher market shooting, the Muncie Hanukkah stabbing attack, which helps us arrive to the question of, do Jews still feel safe in America? So this is a question that's been asked by the AJC. And what we can see is that there has been a real uptick in recent years, especially following the Unite the Right rally in 2017, where Jews now, almost 40% of Jews consider anti-Semitism to be a very serious problem. If you average out the same survey question over the prior decade and a half, you're looking closer to about 25%. So there has been a real jump in concerns related to anti-Semitism. So I entered this broad research project thinking about when, where, why, and to what degree Jews are the target of anti-Semitic hate crimes in the United States. I think some of the obvious things to think about are demographics, Jewish holidays, Israel, and hate groups. And so what I've tried to do in this paper and extend this generalizable theory to other groups is think about how we could categorize the concepts that explain hate crime variation. So the first is opportunity, thinking about the size and concentration of the Jewish community or any minority community of study. Distinguishability, so thinking about the characteristics and traditions that differentiate Jews. Stimuli, so circumstances and events that make anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic motivations more salient. And then thinking about organizations, the hate groups that disseminate, support, and perpetrate anti-Semitism. I'm not going to bother everybody with the data and the model choices. You can peer over that yourself on Perspectives on Politics. So we'll jump straight into the findings. What we find, right, is that population proportion matters in terms of explaining anti-Semitic incident variation. So as a state, for every additional percent that a state increases in Jewish population, you're looking at about a 14.5% increase in the likelihood that that state will report an anti-Semitic incident in a given week. Jewish holidays, at least the widely celebrated visible Jewish holidays of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Passover, and Hanukkah result in a 10.7% increase in the weeks that they're celebrated. Interestingly, I was looking at Jewish incumbent politicians running for re-election, whether or not during the height of those election campaigns, so the 2 weeks before and the 2 weeks following election day, whether we see a significant rise in anti-Semitic incidents in those states. Statistically speaking, it was not significant. I can get into more details here because some more granular results, I think, lead us to some more interesting conclusions. Economic ties, something that we've talked a lot about today with some of our presentations. In unemployment rate change, shocks in unemployment, none of these things help to explain significantly anti-Semitic hate crime variation here in the United States. Israeli military operations. So what brought me to studying this idea here in the United States, even in the most philo-Semitic country in the world, violent Israeli military operations are the single greatest factor in explaining anti-Semitic hate crime variation here in the United States. This is especially true when we look explicitly at violent anti-Semitic hate crime. We know that this is not being driven by other minor conflict incidents or diplomatic events. So this isn't about general Israel salience. This is specifically speaking to violent Israeli military operations. We also know that hate groups matter. So for every additional white nationalist group, neo-Nazi group, and racist skinhead group operating in a state, we see significant increases in reported hate crime in that state. So very, very briefly, I know I'm taking up too much time, but very briefly, I want to talk to you about my book project, Insecurity in Paradise. And I'm happy to discuss any of these issues in greater detail during the Q&A. My opening chapter, my introduction, I should say, really discusses why we're so hesitant to examine anti-Semitism in America. I think some of my colleagues in America can tell you that there are very few people empirically examining anti-Semitic events in the United States. Discuss kind of disputes over concepts and definition. Many of you might note how I'm choosing to spell anti-Semitism today. That might be a sore subject to discuss, but we can't universally identify what a Jew is, let alone spell anti-Semitism in this country with any sort of agreement. So these are the kind of disputes that I think are critical to dive into before discussing the greater details. The empirics, so talking about the demographic estimates, the surveys, and some of the event-based data that we have to look at is chapter 2. Chapter 3, I build on this theoretical structure presented in Perspectives on Politics, the idea of opportunity and distinguishability, talking about how populations, institutions, universities, and holidays help to explain anti-Semitic incident variation. Speak a little bit about stimuli, so Israel, elections, the economy, and the effect that that has or doesn't have on anti-Semitic incidents. Organization, looking specifically at hate groups, BDS, and political parties and political actors here in the United States. And chapter 6 discusses really the consequence of anti-Semitism through a series of elite surveys and community outreach that I'm doing in areas that have been affected by lethal anti-Semitic incidents here in the United States. So I'm going to give you very quickly a couple of teaser findings. So moving beyond the state, I say that because the Perspectives on Politics paper looks at anti-Semitism, reported anti-Semitic incidents at the state level. These findings that will be presented in the book project are looking at it at the FIPS code level, so at the county level or the county equivalent level. I have to say that across the board, the findings are really consistent with the state-based modeling, so that's really great. We can talk about the election of Trump. I know that's, and a little bit about what happened recently, January 6th. But it's worth noting that the second and third most reported anti-Semitic incidents in any Phipps county in any month in the entire data set occurred immediately following the election of Trump in November and December of 2016. I think also of note, we've had a lot of questions about the role of population, contact hypothesis, potential Muslim perpetrator questions. So we can begin to sort of tease some of these things out. As the county level Jewish population increases from minimum to maximum value, the probability of a hate crime targeting a Jewish person significantly increases within the county, while the probability of a hate crime targeting a Muslim or a member of another religious group significantly declines. And what we see is that the percent of the Muslim population does not significantly explain the likelihood of Jewish victimhood or Jewish reported hate crimes in the state, in a county. It also doesn't explain the likelihood of a Muslim hate crime. So I was hoping to talk to Jeff a little bit more about this, considering his really great research on the subject of anti-Semitism at universities. So I hope we'll have that opportunity maybe in Q&A. But I wanted to look at anti-Semitism at universities at the event level. So utilizing AMCA anti-Semitic incidents at the university level, UCR hate crimes at both the Phipps code and university level. What we can see significantly is that Jews are more likely to be targeted at universities than all other minority groups that are measured in the UCR. That's the Uniform Crime Report. This is the FBI data that I'm looking at to examine hate crimes. The presence of SJP groups, that's Students for Justice in Palestine groups, one of the main purveyors of BDS at universities, significantly and with a huge substantive effect explains anti-Semitism that's being reported on college campuses. Interestingly, the presence of a Hillel is insignificant in explaining anti-Semitic incidents. And then thinking about time variant components, Israel Apartheid Week is associated with a significant increase in incidents as well as hate crimes, so spanning both AMCA and the UCR data. Last thing, I'll talk about a little bit about anti-Semitic politicians. So I know we had a discussion about whether or not we should be considering the rhetoric of Trump as engaging in anti-Semitism, and we'll certainly talk more about his rhetoric and QAnon rhetoric and the events of January 6th. But there are explicitly anti-Semitic candidates that are running here in the United States. One is Patrick Little, who was running for the California Open Senate primary in 2018, received nearly 90,000 votes, 1.3% of the vote. And for my colleagues at UC Irvine, he received more support in Orange County than any other county. So maybe we can discuss that a little bit too. Some of the initial findings, and this is really, really rough, but that counties in California with the larger Democratic gains over the last decade, on average, saw the greatest support for Patrick Little. I'm going to pause there. There's so much more that I can share, but I think I've already taken up way too much time. So thank you so, so much for the opportunity. Really appreciate it. Oop. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, well, I didn't unmute myself, so thank you very much. I hope this will generate a lively discussion. So moving onwards to Kyriaki's comments.
Good evening from Athens, Greece, where it's 11:30 in the evening. Hence, the state of my mental state is perhaps not what it should have been. Having said that, I think it's a terrific opportunity for me as well to be here. I'm very thankful, and it has been a fantastic learning experience for me so far. Now, I think we are inversing a bit the dynamic of the previous panel in the sense that I have had the opportunity and privilege of reading Ayal's paper, but with my European eyes, and also bearing in mind the fact that I am not of the same discipline. I have a legal background, so you will forgive me if my thoughts and questions come are biased and come from those two perspectives. The paper is extremely interesting in the sense that it responds to the need to frame the lack of sufficient available knowledge that we have, I guess it seems across both sides of the Atlantic, on how to explain and predict incidents that are targeting minorities in liberal democracies. And I think it holds a lot of potential when it aims to contribute to this discussion on when and where ethno-religious groups are more likely to be the targets of prejudice. I will spare you the summary of the paper because it was done very elegantly, even covering aspects that were not included in the paper, but I will then structure my thoughts according to two axes, two lines. One, first, I think I will ask three questions that relate to my own personal, doubts and curiosities as I was reading the paper. And then I will do what I was asked to do, which is to move a little bit, zoom out as opposed to zooming in, and propose a few possible directions that would allow the research, the paper, the book perhaps, or any future collaboration to go more deeply into anti-Semitism as an area of study. So first, my questions to Ayal. The first question is the following: how would you feel about using more factors to account for when you're explaining variation in anti-Semitic contexts? The situation is the following in Europe. Existing recent literature is, like I suspect in the US, only timidly now beginning to realize that we need to provide more systematic research findings when it comes to anti-Semitism. One of the most experienced leading voices on anti-Semitism, De La Pergola, in 2018 suggested other factors that would help us from an empirical, social, scientific perspective to map, understand, explain, perhaps even predict, which I personally find to be an extremely ambitious aim. These factors, some of these factors are the conceptual, for example, the conceptual contents of the offenses. What is the offense about? Another interesting factor is the ideological background of perpetrators. We touched upon that a little bit in the previous panel. Then a third one, which we haven't talked enough, I feel, about, is the transmission channels of the offense. And here I'm speaking about the digital aspect, which is, gaining a lot of traction and proportionately growing in numbers. Then another very interesting aspect is the depth of the damage caused. More and more, we are trying, especially when it comes to hate crimes and the hate speech, to observe the kind of harm that is caused as a result, and start from the end and move backwards. And then the other possibility that I thought would be relevant for our discussion here is the Jewish response as opposed or in comparison to the general response to any offense and the sanctions applied. So in that framework, I think we would be able to have a more complete mapping, if you want, of how to explain variation in anti-Semitic contexts and patterns of offenses as well. So that's my first, comment/question. The second one is more specific. What is the link between what you call stimuli and organization? Do you feel that there is a causal link between the two? And why am I asking this? Very commonly, and we also discussed this indirectly, in Europe, organizations invent stimuli, and they invent them in brackets through the use of fake news and the like. We heard the example of COVID demonstrations in Germany and how that works. So I'm just wondering to what extent these two can be, distinguished in a very neat way. And then the third question that I had, which is also a more specific one, how does one adjust the factor of opportunity? So the fact that the larger a state's Jewish population is, the greater the number of incidents, anti-Semitic incidents, to circumstances where we have incidence increasing, but population decreasing. And this is what is happening in a lot of Jewish communities in Europe. So just to give you a measure of what we're talking about in percentage, according to the 2020 ODIHR report, the Jewish community represents 1% of the population in Europe, but is reflected in 22% of the hate crimes. There's a mismatch here. So this is where my thinking came from. So these are my essential questions. Now, in terms of new directions, European studies in anti-Semitism, I think currently can be classified in 4 different groups. One group is concerned with data collection. I will come back to that in a second. The second group of studies looks at the nature of anti-Jewish attitudes. There were a lot of points made about that. The third angle would be the perception of anti-Semitism by Jews themselves, which I think is one of the less studied tracks. And then the final one would be the contents of anti-Semitic discourse, with emphasis on new technology, the internet, and how that works as a channel of diffusion of anti-Jewish prejudice. Now, allow me to go back to the data collection. I don't know to what extent you're familiar with the Fundamental Rights Agency, which is the body that collects patterns of discrimination at the European Union level. In their 2020 report, they came out with the following findings. Data collection is a challenge, and it remains a challenge very much like we already discussed. Why? Because we have very few states that record anti-Semitic incidents in a way that allows comparison. The problem is that they use different methodology, so we cannot compare their findings. The second reason is because we have a very imperfect categorization of crimes, blame criminal law for that, and national authorities do not always qualify appropriately offenses, so we don't really count like the German example that was given earlier, and there are a lot more issues with it than the ones that were mentioned, but still, this is a good example. And then obviously the hesitance of victims to report incidents. Now, what are the consequences of these things? We have numbers of recorded incidents that are not reliable, we mentioned that, and they do not give us a good snapshot, a good indication of the state of anti-Semitism. The second problem we have is that we have an overwhelming majority of anti-Semitic incidents that never get reported. And then the third most problematic aspect, in my view, is that we cannot assume that anti-Semitism is more of a problem in states where we have the highest number of incidents recorded, which makes me, doubt a little bit the way you play with the 4 factors. Are numbers sufficient, essentially? It can be the case, for example, that we have more incidents recorded because the system works better. There's an improvement in the efficiency of the system. So that would be one, one way to approach your topic. The second possibility would be based on perceptions of anti-Semitism. And here I wanted to make you aware, in case you were not aware, of this interesting juxtaposition. 36% of the general public in Europe, 36, sees an increase in anti-Semitism in the last 5 years. 89% of Jews responded that yes, we see and we feel an increase in anti-Semitism. These numbers come from the Fundamental Rights Agency survey in 2019. So I think a lot of the problem is, to be located there, and perhaps this is something that we should, focus on. And then connected to that, there is the concern that anti-Semitism is treated as a security issue. I don't know to what extent you acknowledge or, take issue with that, but securitizing is probably not, I think, the most efficient way, although in Europe, as the image of heavily guarded synagogues was conveyed to us earlier on, this is probably a very common approach. As a side remark here, apparently the most commonly used measures when states prefer that kind of approach is to provide security of premises and communities, focus on education on the Holocaust, and then the third leg of this approach is data collection. We already know that these areas are problematic and have huge gaps. A third possibility for future research would be to focus on the transmission channels, and COVID-19 in its relation to anti-Semitism, I think, is a fantastic research opportunity, although not a very happy one. Why? Because there are two things that are happening the way I see it. On the one hand, you have an increase in the proliferation of anti-Semitic speech and conspiracy theories online. Tremendous numbers. By the way, according to the World Jewish Congress, the most common conspiracy theories, to respond to one of the questions that was asked earlier, is that Jews created the coronavirus, Jews spread the coronavirus, and Jews use the virus for profit. So these are the kinds of discourses and rhetorics. But then there's another thing that is happening as far as COVID is concerned, and it's the risk of accelerated loss of the memory of the Holocaust, because a lot of people, due to age, are affected by the virus. So quantitatively, but also qualitatively, we do have evidence, emerging evidence, of course, not comprehensive, that online disinformation is larger than online public health information. So the impact of false information is causing a lot more anti-Semitic impact than the right kind of information, as opposed in relation rather to COVID. So on the basis of that, it's no surprise how opportunities of demonstrations, public demonstrations against the pandemic are infiltrated by anti-Semitic groupings and individuals. So all of this leads me to this question. Would you consider, or have you considered in your upcoming volume, to explore at all the extent to which whether an anti-Semitic offense is perpetrated online matters? It reaches more people. It has perhaps different repercussions. It is also a question of how it is mainstreamed. Another discussion in Germany at the moment is the use of visual instruments and mimes and all of these things to, communicate anti-Semitic hate. And this is also very challenging because the law has a certain difficulty to capture these kinds of nuances, criminal law. So it is even more challenging, apart from the fact that it's heavily unregulated, and that's a separate discussion that, in Germany, they are trying to respond to. And then my final suggestion, if you want, for further work or further research, would be focusing on perpetrators. In Europe, at least, we know that anti-Semitism is not associated with any particular political group, although I do take the point that in Germany, the 93% of anti-Semitic crimes in 2019 were actually from extreme right sympathizers. But consider this, there's another interesting piece of statistics. Half of all incidents against Jews when perpetrators were Islamist also happened online. So there is a very interesting dynamic of growing trend towards a shift in perpetrators. I'm not arguing, and I'm not saying obviously that we are at the same level, but still it is growing, and it is growing fast. I also wanted to make you aware, in case you didn't know, of the fact that there is a very interesting 2019 Anti-Semitism among Islamists in Germany report, which does a very interesting thing, which relates to what we were discussing earlier on. It focuses exclusively on anti-Semitism that comes from Islamist groups. It traces, for example, anti-Semitism within Turkish right-wing extremism and how that relates with the ruling party in Turkey. It also tries to link anti-Semitism with the 1 million new Muslim immigrants and make the case that this is something that we should watch. It also obviously surveys all the political formations in Germany right now that are Muslim or Islamist, should I say, radical Islamist. So here the question would be, depending on who the perpetrator is, does it really change the form of action? Does it change the degree of development? And what can one learn from those kinds of analysis where it's a more, actor-based, if you want, analysis? But I think I'll stop here because I probably bombarded you with too much information, but I should stress that this was a terrific paper and I look forward to reading the book. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much, Kyriaki, for your comments. I'm going to add more burden on you, Ayal. There are some questions from the audience. Hopefully we can have 2 rounds of Q&As. But thank you both for your insightful remarks and really opening up a lot of avenues for us to discuss. So let me start with the first question from it's from Carl Goldberg. And I'll just read it to you. The previous segment on anti-Semitism in Germany pointed to the mosques as a source of anti-Semitism. In America, we have a number of videos of imams preaching to large congregations in their mosques, whereby the imams are calling upon Allah to kill all the Jews. Can someone please discuss the mosques and Muslim religious organizations as a source of anti-Semitism? So that's a question, Muslims and anti-Semitism. The second question I'm going to, is a question about arming. So that's the US specific question, obviously. As a result of attacks, the Jewish institutions arm themselves. Is it becoming widespread according to your research? I can certainly say that this is a trend in Phoenix for sure, when the communities take security upon themselves. And then there is a third question, and then there is going to be a fourth question when I will abuse the power of the chair. The third question is sort of a more comment on anti-establishment and populism. I will sort of rephrase the comment. Would it be possible to think about the Jews as part of the establishment, and therefore they can, generate a populist or even a violent reaction? So that I'm, paraphrasing someone's question here. So basically, Jews and their relationship with the establishment are being viewed as an establishment and therefore being attacked. And then let me sort of ask my own question, which I think is sort of an important question. Sort of in the paper, you cite the Anti-Defamation League, and which estimates that the ceiling or the pool of anti-Semites in the United States is 10%. That's something similar that was in Jeff's paper when he sort of reported 10 to 12%, but sort of the softer versions of anti-Semitism can go up to 20, 25%. So what's your general take on the, what's the ceiling of the hardcore anti-Semites in the population, if we can think about it this way? So, okay, Jeff has a question. So please, Ayal, bear with Jeff. And after Jeff, I don't see anyone else. I will close the Q&A after Jeff. And last call. Okay, Jeff, and then Ariel Rosenberg, and then I will close it. So Jeff, please, and then I will read the question from Ariel.
Thanks so much for your paper. I think this is a wonderful paper and a great project, an important project. So there's an implication. It's not just an implication. It's kind of obvious from your data. There's that wonderful book by Philip Roth called Operation Shylock, where the fake Philip Roth goes to Israel and says, the problem is Israel has become the greatest danger to Jews in the world. Therefore, Jews need to leave Israel and go back to Europe. Well, they'll be welcomed back to Poland. Our Jews are back. Our Jews are back. Thank God our Jews are back. And it's ridiculous, of course, and that it's meant to be ridiculous. But there's an element of your paper that has that. Because, in fact, one of your strongest, if not your strongest correlation, is that what produces bad news for Jews in the diaspora is the attempt or the success of Israel in defending itself militarily. Right? And so, do you want to leave it at that as a kind of terrible irony, or do you want to actually, Ayal, give us a moral statement? I mean, what's your point? What's your point? Why are you telling us this information? It's important information. If I were sitting in Israel, I'd say, ah, yeah, this terrible anti-Zionist guy. This terrible anti-Zionist, he's running around the world telling Jews that Israel is the greatest danger to them. He's like the fake Philip Roth in Operation Shylock, right? So that's just to stir the pot just a little tiny bit.
So let me, I have one more question. I think that's really important, and I'm sure we will come back to this in the roundtable discussions about the new media. And I think it's, I would just throw it in and then I will close the Q&A. It's from Ariel Rosenberg. What role do you think that apps like Telegram and Parler play in the spreading of anti-Semitic propaganda? A lot of it seems to be generated by Russian accounts due to their syntax and some of the narratives propagated. In a way, it feels like neo-protocols of the elders of Zion. So, Ayal, you probably have to be a little bit selective, but thank you very much for sharing your work with us.
I'm so appreciative of all the questions. If for whatever reason, because I think if I was a computer, I would have had to restart like 8 different times during the last 20 minutes. If for whatever reason I don't answer your question directly, just email me. I will make sure that you have the response you desire. So I apologize in advance for what I'm going to miss. I'm gonna go to with what I was just given from panelists in the audience, and then I'll circle back to the discussant. So Carl asked about the attitudes and the behavior of certain mosques, certain imams that are preaching specifically anti-Semitic hate here in the United States. I think there's no doubt that contributes to anti-Semitism as an attitude and belief in the United States. And I'm sure that it contributes to specific events and hate crimes. Thinking to the Seattle shooting in 2006, this was perpetrated by Navid Haq, who was a self-proclaimed Muslim who was motivated to engage with the Seattle Jewish Federation in part because of the behavior of Israel. This was during the Second Lebanon War. So I think there are links here. The problem that I would say is in the data. The Uniform Crime Report does not have a good and systematic reporting of perpetrators. It's usually, I think it's just under 25% of all anti-Semitic incidents listed in the data have a perpetrator listed. And even if they do not list by religion. So there's no way with the data that I'm given, the data that I'm using, for me to really evaluate this in that kind of granular, who is the offender detail that I think so many of us are looking for. What I tried to do when I'm looking at FIPS codes, which is looking at just the general proportion of the population of a county that is Muslim or Jewish, right? That the size of the Muslim population really doesn't have an effect on the likelihood of reported anti-Semitic incidents. That's a rather crude finding, I know. I think you're right to challenge me to go further and to dive deeper into this issue. Could I go in and hand code some of the mosques that are engaging in some of the more extreme rhetoric and then kind of dummy those counties out in my models and examine that? Yeah, I think I probably could, and it's definitely worth thinking about in the future. So I really appreciate that question. There was a comment / question about Jews arming themselves, synagogues arming themselves. It goes a little bit back to what Dr. Topidi was talking about in terms of the securitization question for Jews that especially Jews in Europe are facing right now. I see that that is happening. It's clear that that is happening across the country. The Tree of Life Synagogue really changed the way that synagogues, Jewish community organizations think about security. I don't know how long that is going to last, but I imagine it's going to last quite a while because we have seen a real influx of lethal anti-Semitism in this country over the past several years. So we haven't had a long enough lull for, I think, synagogues and Jewish institutions to think about, kind of toning down the question of security. And when we think about other incidents, again, thinking about the attack on the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., it was not any Jews that died as a result of that attack. It was an armed security guard at the front of the museum that they credit with saving tens, maybe even more lives because he was successfully able to engage the perpetrator of that attack with a weapon. Again, I don't mean to be advocating for certain security measures. I'm just trying to report kind of what I see as it relates to the overall picture of securitization here in the United States. There's a question about Jews as part of the establishment. You're really stealing my thunder here for the panel, because I think that's a huge part of all of this. I think there's a question of definitions, though. Are we talking about the establishment, or are we talking about something that's beyond the establishment? I think thinking about the establishment, the role of the establishment, especially in kind of thinking about modern perspectives, mostly conservative perspectives or populist perspectives as it relates to the government, it's not a highly charged term. So I think when we think about the establishment, yeah, there might be frustration with the establishment, but there's very high levels of concern with the cabal, with the globalists. And I think that when we start to realize that some people's establishment characters are fully functioning card-carrying members of the cabal to others, it kind of helps to elucidate concerns with Jewish disproportionate representation in the US government. So when we think about the Biden administration, the arms of justice in this country, the Attorney General is a Jewish individual. And we think about the Treasury. We have Janet Yellen, that is a Jewish individual I think she might have been confirmed during this webinar. We'll have that position, and the White House Chief of Staff, amongst many other really important positions, all tend to be held by and occupied Jewish individuals. I am 100% sure that anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists are going to run rampant with that fact. So yes, I think there is a connection here between Jewish disproportionate representation in the quote unquote establishment and anti-Semitism, but I'm not convinced that it's the people that consider them establishment that we really have to worry about. What else do I have here? Lenka was talking to me a little bit about anti-Semitism in the population. I actually have a really great slide about this. I'm going to pull it up in the background, and maybe I'll just share it briefly because it's almost like I primed you to ask this question. I didn't. So this is kind of my assessment on varying intensities of anti-Semitism in the United States. Really, I think the number of individuals that have no anti-Semitic attitudes or beliefs in this country is somewhere between 75 to 90%. So I think that definitely comports well with some of the other estimates that Jeff brought up, the ADL has brought up. I think that there is this gray area, right? That there are people that hold some anti-Semitic attitudes or beliefs. In some cases, they're positive associations and stereotypes of Jews that we still might consider to be problematic. In other cases, these are related to traditionalist interpretations of Jews' role in the death of Christ. But these aren't things that are regularly cultivated. The individuals that hold these attitudes or beliefs aren't regularly or purposefully cultivating these positions. I think there's about 7% to 3% of the population that really develops their anti-Semitism. Not only do they hold these attitudes and beliefs, many of them acknowledge these attitudes and beliefs. I think what Jeff was talking about earlier, the surprising fact that people will say that Jews do engage in the use of Christian blood for ritual purposes, that people answer yes to that in questions. There is still a large number of people that hold beliefs that we find, of course, heinous, but that are what we believe is also completely socially undesirable, that are happy to further cultivate those positions. I think that there's about 2% to 1% of the population that actually go out and socialize about this issue. So it might not be that they're engaged in a specific organization that has a mission of purveying anti-Semitism, but in their friend group, right, they talk about Jews, right? It's something that they're interested in discussing. I think that's about 2% and 1%. You can look at the findings from Who Voted for Patrick Little, right, in California. About 1.3% of the population that participated in the primary election. There's no explanation for voting for Patrick Little other than you are an anti-Semite, when Patrick Little ran under the platform that the Holocaust is a lie, and that and that Jews need to be removed from this country by any means possible. And then I think that we've also talked a little bit about anti-Semitic attitudes and beliefs kind of being almost a theology, right? This is the type of individual who wakes up and the entire world can be explained by Jews, right? The entire world, their entire worldview, their attitudes, their beliefs, why they wake up in the morning is to explain everything that is happening negative in the world as a consequence of Jews. So I hope that helps, and I can go into greater detail about how I arrived at those positions, but I think that's the breakdown that I see in the United States based on my research. Jeff, talking about Philip Roth, Operation Shylock, asking me to engage in a normative statement, even though I'm an objective, empirics-based political scientist, how taboo. No, so first of all, I'll say that it is a really interesting question, not just from the normative perspective, also from the empirics. Why does Netanyahu go to Paris following terrible incidents, stand in the synagogue and tell the Jews to come home, come to Israel, come home? There was a tremendous amount of pushback following the Tree of Life synagogue when several members of the Knesset tweeted out very similar messages to American Jews. There was significant pushback by Benjamin Netanyahu and others in his administration that this was not the appropriate course of action. There is a real empirical question about the uniqueness, the exceptionalism of American Judaism going all the way back to, as I'm sure many of you guys know, the Blaustein-Ben Gurion exchanges. So I think there's a lot to unpack here. In terms of a normative statement, I am just presenting to you guys information that I'm seeing within the data. I'm not suggesting that Israel is somehow criminally, going back to the discussant, right, and her legal position, criminally liable for the insecurity of diaspora Jews or anything of the sort. I acknowledge the irony of Israel's existence for the Jewish people, and then it also being a cause of diaspora insecurity. And I think that irony is something that the state, and here's my normative statement, I think that is something that the state should consider. The state of Israel has made multiple efforts in the past to respond to the grievances of the diaspora, not just specific events, but overall repression that Jews faced around the world. And they don't get to have it both ways. They have to acknowledge when, even if it's not their fault, and that's the moral component here, that their actions or the perceptions of their actions, or even the fictitious lies that are used at least out of their actions, are responsible for diaspora insecurity. They have to account for that. How they do that, I am an Israeli citizen, but only in passing. So it's not really fair for me to ask Israel to do specific things. There was a question about Russian accounts. I think we'll talk more about Parler, the pervasiveness of anti-Semitism on online communities in the next segment. But I will say this: there is a real challenge when I talk to members of the security field about what the right approach is when it comes to engaging with anti-Semitism or curtailing anti-Semitism online. Yes, it is no doubt a huge reason why and a huge mechanism for purveyors of anti-Semitism to recruit, to engage with other anti-Semites. But a lot of this is monitorable. The security forces in this country, the intelligence apparatus does a pretty good job. I know we can discuss that in light of January 6th, but they do a pretty good job of accounting for this, and their algorithms are acceptable when it comes to determining who is quote unquote a real threat. There have been 12,000 hate crimes targeting Jews from 2001 to 2014, which was the area that I was looking at in this paper, 12,000. I can promise you that if not for the ability of security forces to monitor these individuals, some of these individuals' interactions, potential perpetrators' interactions online, that number would be tenfold. So there is real value in having that opportunity. That being said, there is certainly a risk reward that we need to discuss as a panel moving forward. I haven't even gotten yet to all the amazing comments from my discussant. I know I'm going to have to be really selective. I'm just going to start with the first series of comments talking about more factors. Yes, 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 always more factors. That's just another paper. That's absolutely critical. Looking at the type of offense. I know I do that a little bit in this paper, talking about the difference between events that are violent in nature. Those events tend to target the individual rather than things like institutions, and kind of comparing that to vandalism, and events that are targeting kind of specific locations rather than individuals. I think there's a lot of room to disaggregate crimes further. Again, that will be teased out further in the book with certainty. And I'm working on several papers looking at hate crimes, not just targeting Jews, with Regina Branton and Val Martinez Evers at UNT looking at that very issue. So I can promise you more is on the way for that. So really great. The ideology of offender, I kind of talked about the problem that we have with offender statistics. We talked a little bit about the digital component. I'll couch that until the next presentation. The depth of the damage caused. This is an absolutely critical question. When you brought up, when we think about hate crimes, what is their real impact to the community? I really don't explore that much, if at all, in the Perspectives paper. I can tell you that I'm running a survey that looks at exposure to anti-Semitic incidents and how it changes attitudes, both amongst Jews and amongst a nationally representative sample, to issues related to racism broadly, and then things specific about anti-Jewish security and also attitudes towards Israel. So I think that you're absolutely right to bring up this point. When we think about hate crimes, it's really easy to think about them as discrete events. This person's house had a swastika drawn on it. This cemetery had several gravestones toppled over, and therefore we can dismiss it rather easily as somebody that's not connected to that community or that doesn't know that individual. But I think that most people that suffer these incidents need to understand that the motivation of the offender is not to target the individual, right? It's a hate crime precisely because they're looking to make an impact and make an entire community feel uncomfortable, insecure, unwelcome. And that's the real damage that we see from hate crimes. And we don't really know. There hasn't been a lot of great, at least empirical work to examine what the extent of those effects are. I'm looking up, I see I have 1 minute left. I feel like I've been talking for 30 seconds. So I don't really know what to do, but thank you so much for the opportunity. It was amazing.